The land kept its own counsel. Out on the raw edge of the Comanche, where the sky was a brutal, infinite blue and the earth was cracked parchment, silence was the first and final language. Jedediah Kane knew that language. He spoke it fluently, in the harsh grammar of wind and the syntax of dust. His cabin, a ragged fist of timber clenched against the vastness, was less a home than a self-imposed tomb, a place to let the ghosts of his past howl without audience. He had come here to forget the man he was: a scout, a guide, a Judas goat in a blue coat who had once led soldiers into the heart of a canyon that should have been a sanctuary. He had led them to a village teeming with life and left it a smoldering pyre of horseflesh and human grief. The army had called it a victory. The Comanche had given it a name whispered only in curses. Jedediah called it the fracturing of his soul. Now he measured his existence in sunrises he didn't deserve and sunsets that brought a merciful darkness. He was a man whittled down to remorse, living on a ridge that gave him a clear view of his own damnation. From this vantage on a clear day, he could see the distant, hazy cut in the earth, Palo Duro Canyon, the place where he had traded his honor for 30 pieces of silver and the bitter taste of survival. It was a night choked with the memory of winter, the air still holding a knife's edge of cold when the silence was broken, not by a coyote's cry or the shudder of wind, but by a sound so alien and desperate it seemed to tear the fabric of the dark. A thin, rasping breath, followed by a soft percussive thud against the packed earth outside his door. Jedediah froze, his hand hovering over the tin cup of chicory he'd been nursing. He was not a man who received visitors. The only company he kept was the specter of his own making. He grabbed the heavy Winchester leaning against the wall, its cold weight a familiar, if hollow, comfort. Moving with the practiced quiet of a man who once stalked human beings for a living, he pressed his eye to a chink in the log wall. Nothing. Just the obsidian blackness of a moonless night, the stars like chips of ice flung across an endless void. He waited. A full minute passed, the only sound the frantic hammering in his own chest. Then it came again, a sigh. Not of contentment, but of a body surrendering its last fight. He unlatched the door, the groan of the wood hinge unnaturally, loud in the profound quiet. He held his rifle ready, stepping onto the porch, his eyes scanning the periphery, and then he saw it. A small, dark shape huddled near the base of the steps, no bigger than a discarded sack. He lowered the rifle, his breath catching in his throat. It was a child, or what was left of one. A girl, her buckskin dress soaked and stiff with a darker stain that wasn't water. Her hair, long and black, was matted with blood and dirt, fanned out around her head like a broken wing. She was Comanche. He knew it from the beading on her worn moccasins, from the delicate, high line of her cheekbones, from the defiant stillness of her form, even in unconsciousness. He knelt, the cold of the ground seeping through his worn trousers. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the starlight, her lips tinged with blue. A gash ran along her temple, ugly and deep, but it was the spreading stain on her side that spoke of imminent death. He laid 2 fingers against her neck. The pulse was a frantic fading bird's wing, faint, but there. To help her was to invite a reckoning he had spent years trying to outrun. To bring a Comanche child, bloodied and dying, into his home was to light a beacon that every warrior in the territory would see. They would come. Not with questions, but with arrows and a justice as old as the stones beneath his feet. To leave her was to commit one final unforgivable sin. It was to look upon the face of the people he had wronged and turn away. He stared up at the indifferent stars, then back down at the child. In her stillness, he saw the faces of the women and children from the canyon, their eyes wide with terror as the world burned around them. He had ridden away then. He would not ride away now. With a grunt that was more prayer than sound, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a whisper, a bundle of fragile bones and chilling cold. As he lifted her, her head lolled back, and a single guttural word escaped her lips. A name not meant for his ears, a name that was not Comanche. It was a soldier's name, spat like a curse. Whitaker. A hawk screamed somewhere in the high, dark distance, a lonely, piercing cry that echoed the desolation in Jedediah's heart. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the night, and in the sudden, enclosed silence of the cabin, he felt the world outside holding its breath, waiting. The debt was coming due. The cabin became a crucible. 2 worlds, 2 wounds, sharing a single fragile shelter. Jedediah laid her on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire structure, and for a long moment he just stared. In the flickering lamplight, he saw the truth of her more clearly. She was not a small child, perhaps 10 or 12 winters old. Her face, even slack with pain, held a severity that belied her years, and there were scars. Thin, white, deliberate. Lines on her forearms, almost ritualistic. The marks of a grief far older than the wound on her temple. He was no healer, but he knew death. He had dealt it and seen it, and he knew its scent. It was on her, a cloying sweetness beneath the iron tang of blood. He worked with a grim, focused desperation. He stripped away the stiff, blood-soaked buckskin, his hands hesitating for only a second at the intimacy of the act. Her body was thin, wiry, her ribs a stark cage beneath her skin. He cleaned the gash on her side, a vicious puncture wound, likely from a bayonet or a thrown knife. It was deep, angry, and weeping. All he had were the old remedies. Poultices of yarrow to staunch the bleeding, a mash of willow bark for the fever he knew would come. He worked in silence, his movements economical, the skills of the frontier. At odds with the turmoil in his soul. This was an intimacy he had not known since his wife Sarah had been taken by the fever years before he'd even donned the Army's blue. He had failed to save her. The thought came unbidden, sharp as a shard of glass. He was not a hero. He was a man steeped in shame. As he bound her wound with strips of clean linen torn from his own spare shirt, his mind replayed the canyon. Not the battle, but the aftermath, the silence, the smoke clinging to the winter air, Colonel Mackenzie's grim satisfaction, and his own order given to his small scouting party as they combed the ruins for survivors. No one is to be left. It was an order of extermination. He had obeyed, his rifle feeling like a lead weight in his hands, until he'd seen 2 small children scrambling into a crevice in the rock face. He had raised his rifle. Their eyes, wide and black and utterly without hope, had met his. And, for the first time in his life, Jedediah Kane had refused an order. He had turned his horse, fired a shot into the air, and yelled, "Clear over here," leading the others away. He was discharged for insubordination a week later, cast out, a man without a tribe, white or red. Now one of them was here, on his cot, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. Had he saved her only to watch her die? For 2 days, she drifted in and out of a fevered haze. She thrashed and cried out in a language he did not understand, her hands clenching and unclenching. He spooned water and thin broth between her lips, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He sat by her side, watching the fire, feeling like a sentry at the gates of hell. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke to find her eyes open. Watching him, they were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, dark, and bottomless, holding a universe of pain and fury. She did not speak. She did not move. She just watched, her gaze a physical weight. He offered her a bowl of broth. She stared at it, then at him, her expression unreadable. He set it on the small crate beside the cot and retreated to the other side of the cabin, giving her space. The silence between them was a living thing. It was louder than gunfire, heavier than stone. It was the silence of the canyon, of the dead, of judgment. He busied himself with mending a harness, the familiar work a comfort to his hands. But he could feel her gaze on his back, tracking his every move. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, its light shifting through the single grimy window. Finally he heard a small sound, a scraping. He turned. She had pushed herself up to a sitting position, her face a mask of agony. She had taken the bowl, and she was drinking from it, her eyes never leaving his. She drank it all, then set the bowl down with a deliberate, soft click. Then she turned her gaze to the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the room in a soft, pulsating orange light. She stared at the flames, not with the curiosity of a child, but with a horrifying, knowing intensity. It was the look of someone who remembered fire not as a source of warmth, but as a weapon, as a killer. In that moment, they were not a man and a girl. They were two ghosts under one roof, haunted by the same fire, and the silence between them was a shared, unspoken scream. A fragile truce settled over the cabin, as delicate as a spider's thread. The girl began to heal, her body's resilience a quiet miracle. The wound on her side, though still a vicious purple seam, began to close. The gash on her temple scabbed. Over, but her silence remained absolute, a fortress he could not breach. He learned her rhythms. She would wake with the first hint of light, her eyes already open and watchful. She would accept the food he prepared, eating with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed out of place in the rustic squalor of his life. He gave her a name in his own mind, the Watcher, for that is what she did. Her gaze followed him, unblinking, analytical. It wasn't the frightened stare of a captive, but the measured assessment of a judge. He found himself moving more deliberately under her scrutiny, the rough edges of his solitude softened by the mere presence of another soul. He even began to talk to her, not expecting a reply, but simply to fill the crushing silence. He spoke of the land, of the way the seasons turned, of the horse he'd once owned. He never spoke of the army, or the canyon, or the reasons for his exile. Those words were buried too deep. One afternoon, while cleaning the last of her bloody clothes, he found it. Tucked inside a fold of the buckskin dress was a small, tarnished brass button. A U.S. cavalry button. It felt like a hot coal in his palm. He knew what it meant. The man she had named Whitaker was a soldier. He was the one who had hurt her. The thought sent a cold dread coiling in his gut. He imagined a lone soldier, perhaps a deserter or a straggler, finding her, and the ugly scene that followed. The coat he'd found her in, a soldier's greatcoat several sizes too large, had not been for warmth. It had been a trophy or a shroud. He took the button and the coat outside. With his spade, he dug a hole behind the cabin, a small, neat grave. He laid the coat inside, placing the button on top of it, and covered it with earth. It felt like a funeral. A burying of evidence, yes, but also a severing. He was burying his own past along with it. When he returned to the cabin, her eyes were on him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that she had watched the entire act from the window. She knew what he had buried. A few days later, something shifted. The air grew warmer, and he left the cabin door ajar to let in the scent of the coming spring. He was carving a piece of cottonwood, trying to shape it into a crude bird for her. A peace offering of sorts. He wasn't an artist, and his hands were clumsy with anything but an axe or a rifle. He heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching. He looked over. She was sitting by the hearth, which was cold now, the ashes a uniform velvety gray. She had a piece of charcoal from the fire bucket and was drawing in the ash on the stone. He put down his carving and watched, mesmerized. Her small fingers moved with a deftness and certainty that was breathtaking. She was not doodling, she was creating a world. First, a horse, not just a stick figure, but a creature of muscle and spirit, its head thrown back, its mane a wild banner. Then, a buffalo, immense and shaggy, the ancient soul of the plains. She drew a river, a winding snake of a thing, and beside it, a series of symbol circles, crosses, patterns of stars. It was a map, not of geography, but of memory, of belonging. He felt like an intruder, looking upon something sacred and not meant for his eyes. He was about to turn away when she began to hum. It was not a child's tune. It was a low, guttural, vibrating chant that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. It was a song of mourning, of loss, of a profound and unshakable identity. It rose and fell, a thread of sound weaving through the quiet cabin. It was heartbreakingly beautiful and utterly terrifying. And then he realized it. The melody wasn't directed at him. It wasn't for the dead. She was looking past him through the open door to the ridge beyond. She was humming to someone who was listening. The fragile peace shattered. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with an unseen presence. This was not a song of healing. It was a summons. He looked out the door at the empty, sun-drenched landscape, but he knew, with the primal instinct of a scout who has felt the unseen eyes of an enemy on his back, that they were no longer alone. The quiet before the storm had just ended. The dawn came not with light, but with a slow dilution of the darkness. A thick, pearlescent fog clung to the ground, swallowing the landscape and muffling all sound. The world was reduced to the small island of Jedediah's cabin. He hadn't slept. He had sat in his chair, the Winchester across his knees, watching the girl as she slept soundly for the first time since her arrival. Her song had ended at dusk, but its echo remained, a vibration. In the very logs of the cabin, he knew they would come. He didn't know when or how many. He just knew the summons had been answered. He saw the first one through the fog, a ghost materializing from the mist. A single rider on the crest of the ridge, a silhouette against the pale, bruised sky. He sat motionless on his horse, a long rifle held across his lap. He was a statue, carved from shadow and patience. Jedediah's heart, which had been a frantic drum all night, settled into a slow, heavy beat. The waiting was over. Then another figure appeared beside the first, and another, and another. They did not ride down. They simply filled the empty space on the ridge, appearing out of the fog as if they were born of it. 10, 20, 50. A silent, imposing line of Comanche warriors on horseback, their faces grim, their presence a crushing weight that seemed to suck the very air from the valley. They were not painted for war. This was something different. Something graver. The land itself fell silent. The chirping of early birds ceased. The whisper of the wind died. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Then the line of riders parted. A man began to walk down the gentle slope towards the cabin. He was on foot, a sign of immense authority. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face a roadmap of hard years and harder wisdom. His long, graying braids were wrapped in otter fur. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings, but he moved with the power of a king. Beside him, with a hand on the great man's shoulder, walked a young boy, no older than the girl in the cabin. This was the chief. Jedediah watched him approach. Every instinct screamed at him to raise the rifle, to make a stand. It was the white man's way, the soldier's way. But Jedediah Kane, the soldier, was dead and buried. What stood on the porch now was something else, something stripped down to the bone. He laid the Winchester carefully against the cabin wall, a gesture of surrender that cost him every ounce of his pride. He stepped off the porch and stood in the damp, cold dirt, waiting. The chief stopped 20 paces away. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Jedediah, taking in his worn clothes, his bearded, haunted face, his empty hands. The chief's gaze was not filled with hatred. It was filled with a terrifying, ancient clarity. It was the look of a man who had come not to fight, but to weigh a soul. The girl appeared in the doorway behind Jedediah. She stood there, wrapped in one of his blankets, her small form framed by the dark interior of the cabin. She looked at the chief, and for the first time, her face showed an emotion other than pain or watchfulness. It was a look of profound, heartbreaking relief. The chief's eyes moved from Jedediah to the girl, and a flicker of something, pain, love, recognition, crossed his features. He then looked back at Jedediah. The silence stretched, taut and humming with unspoken history. Finally, the chief spoke. His voice was low, resonant, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. The words were English, spoken with a heavy, deliberate accent, meant for him alone. "You have one who is ours." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of ownership, of a bond that Jedediah could never comprehend. All the lies he could have told, all the justifications he could have offered, turned to dust in his mouth. There was only one response that held any truth. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He stopped before the great chief, the smell of wood smoke and sage and horse clinging to the man. And Jedediah Kane, the former U.S. cavalry scout, the man who had helped bring ruin to this man's people, slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee in the dirt. He did not bow his head in fear, but in a profound and long overdue act of atonement. The weight of the canyon, the ghosts of the dead, the shame of his life, he laid it all down at the feet of this man. Under the silent, judging eyes of the 50 warriors on the ridge, the chief, Para Okum, did not move. He simply watched. The white man kneel, his expression as unreadable as the stone cliffs of the Llano Estacado. The test had begun. He motioned with his head, and 2 warriors dismounted, their movements fluid and silent. They did not draw weapons. They walked past Jedediah and into the cabin. Jedediah remained on his knee, his head bowed, the dampness of the earth seeping into his trousers, a cold baptism. He heard them moving inside, their soft moccasins barely making a sound on the wooden floor. He heard a low murmur of conversation in the Comanche tongue. The girl, who he now knew must be more than just a random child, was speaking to them. Her voice, which he was hearing for the first time beyond a single whispered name and a fevered cry, was clear and steady. After a long moment, the 2 warriors emerged. One of them carried the small, crudely carved bird Jedediah had been working on. He held it out to Para Okum. The chief took the piece of wood, turning it over in his powerful hands. His gaze then fell on the hearth, visible through the open door, where the girl's drawings were still faintly visible in the ash. He saw the map of her people's soul, drawn in the heart of the white man's home. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding in their depths. He looked toward the back of the cabin, at the small, rectangular patch of freshly turned earth where Jedediah had buried the cavalry coat. Para Okum's gaze returned to the kneeling man. "Stand," he commanded. Jedediah rose slowly, his joints stiff, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He met the chief's eyes, prepared for the sentence. "You are the scout," Para Okum said, the words falling like chips of granite. "The one they called Tabe Betsy, Sunslayer. You led the Pony soldiers into the canyon of our mothers." The name hit Jedediah like a physical blow. Sunslayer. That was what they had called him. The man who showed the bluecoats the way, who brought the shadow that extinguished the light of their village. He had not known they had a name for him, but hearing it now felt like a brand being pressed into his flesh. He flinched, but did not look away. "Yes," Jedediah said, his voice raspy, "I am that man." A ripple of tension went through the warriors on the ridge. Hands tightened on rifles and bows. This was the confession. This was the moment justice would be served. But the girl stepped forward, moving to stand beside the chief. She looked not at Jedediah, but at Para Okum, who was her uncle. She spoke, again in their tongue, her voice rising with a passion and clarity that commanded the attention of every man present. She gestured toward Jedediah, then pointed back toward the hazy outline of the distant canyon. She spoke of smoke and screaming, of soldiers on horseback cutting down those who fled. She spoke of a man named Whitaker, a monster who had pursued her and her cousin, who had killed her cousin and left her for dead. Then her voice softened. She described hiding, bleeding in the chaos. And she described seeing one scout, this scout, to Babetsi, on a gray horse. She told of how another soldier, a corporal, had seen her and her younger sister trying to crawl into a crevice and had charged toward them, his saber drawn. But the scout, the Sunslayer, had wheeled his horse suddenly, cutting off the corporal's path, creating a moment of confusion. He had yelled and pointed in another direction, drawing the soldier away. In that single fleeting moment of defiance, she and her sister had been able to scramble to safety. He had not saved her, but he had given her a chance. He had refused to complete the slaughter. This was the first shocking twist in the heart of the reckoning. His greatest sin was inextricably bound to his one secret act of grace. Para Okum listened, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes, fixed on Jedediah, held a dawning complex light. The girl finished speaking and fell silent, her testimony hanging in the cold morning air. Jedediah's mind reeled. He remembered the moment. The two small faces in the rocks, the charging corporal, the lie he had shouted. He had lived with the shame of the massacre, but he had held on to that one small act, that one refusal, as the only proof that he had not entirely lost his soul. He never knew if the children had survived. He never dared to hope. And now one of them stood before him, the living embodiment of his past's terrible tangled duality. But there was another truth yet to be revealed. The girl looked at Jedediah, truly looked at him, for the first time without a barrier of silence or judgment between them. She spoke, this time in the halting English she must have learned at some mission or trading post. My sister, she was small. The coughing sickness took her last winter. Her voice was heavy with loss. She saw you. In a dream vision, before the soldiers came. She saw a man with a sun-colored beard standing between us and a dark shadow. She said you had a hole in your spirit, like a canyon in your heart. The second twist. It was not just a random act of mercy. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy, a vision seen by a dying child. He had not just stumbled into this. He had been called to it, pulled by the threads of a fate woven long ago. He was not a savior. He was a tool of a power far older and more mysterious than he could comprehend. He was a broken man used to mend a broken circle. I did not know, he whispered, the words inadequate, hollow. Para Okum raised a hand, silencing him. The chief's face was a storm of conflicting emotions, the old grief for his people, the anger at the man who had guided their destroyers, and a new, grudging awe at the strange path of this man's spirit. The debt is not a simple one, the chief said, his voice resonating with the weight of his decision. Death is too easy for a man with a canyon in his heart. It would not fill the hole, it would only make it wider. He turned and gave an order in the Comanche tongue. Two warriors walked to the edge of the clearing and began to build a fire. Not a small cook fire, but a large ceremonial fire, laying the wood with a precision that was both beautiful and ominous. Jedediah watched them, a cold certainty settling over him. This was it, not a simple execution by bullet or knife. It would be a trial by fire, a purification, a punishment meant to match the scale of his crime. He looked at the flames as they began to lick at the kindling, and for the first time since leaving the army, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had run from this fire his entire life. Now he would finally walk into it. He deserved the pain. He deserved the end. He lowered his head and murmured, almost to himself, "Let it be done." The fire grew, its roar swallowing the morning silence, its heat pushing back the lingering fog. The warriors formed a wide, silent circle around it. their stoic faces illuminated by the dancing, hungry flames. Para Okum led Jedediah toward the inferno. Jedediah did not resist. His steps were heavy but steady. This was his absolution. He welcomed it. He expected to be pushed into the blaze or tied to a stake. He braced himself for the searing pain. His mind filled with a final image of Sarah's face. He was ready. But Para Okum stopped him at the edge of the circle of heat. The chief turned not to Jedediah, but to the girl. He spoke to her in their language, his voice gentle. She nodded and walked back to Jedediah's cabin. For a moment, she disappeared inside. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the fire. She emerged carrying a small clay bowl. It was filled with a dark, wet paste. She walked to the hearth of the great fire and scooped a handful of hot, gray ash, mixing it into the clay with her fingers. Then she walked toward Jedediah. He watched her approach, confused. This was not the prelude to an execution he had imagined. The girl whose name he still did not know stopped directly in front of him. She looked up, and her eyes held no fear, no anger, only a profound, solemn gravity. Para Okum spoke. "You believe this is your funeral fire, Sunslayer. You are wrong. We do not burn a man who returns a living ember from a fire he helped to set. That is not justice. That is waste." Jedediah stared, his mind unable to process the words. This was the moment of irrational mercy, the turn he could never have predicted. He had begged for punishment, and they were giving him something else. "Kneel," Para Okum commanded again. This time, when Jedediah dropped to his knee, it was not just in atonement, but in utter, soul-shaking bewilderment. He bowed, his head exposing the back of his neck, the gesture of a man surrendering completely to a fate he did not understand. The world seemed to hold its breath. The girl, this small, scarred child who was the last witness to his single moment of grace, reached out. Her hand, small and warm, rested on the crown of his bowed head. The touch was electric, a current of forgiveness and connection that shot through his entire being. It was a benediction. With her other hand, she dipped her fingers into the bowl of ash and clay. Slowly, reverently, she began to draw on his face. She traced a line from his forehead down the bridge of his nose. She drew 2 more lines across his cheeks, from the corners of his eyes to his jawline. The mixture was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the fire. It was not a mark of shame, it was a mark of belonging, of being claimed. When she was finished, she stepped back. Para Okum looked down at him, his face stern but not unkind. "The man called Jedediah Kane is dead. The scout known as Sunslayer is a ghost. You carry a new name now." He spoke the Comanche words slowly, so Jedediah could hear each syllable. Paita Anhua. It means, "he who returned the ember." The chief placed a hand on Jedediah's shoulder and pulled him to his feet. "This is not a gift. It is a burden. An ember must be tended. It must be guarded from the wind. It must be kept alive, so that it may one day become a fire again." They were not giving him a wife or a place in their tribe in the way a white man might understand it. They were giving him a duty, a purpose. The fire was not for his death. It was for his rebirth. A naming ceremony sealed with the ash of the fire he had watched for her, mixed with the clay of the land he had wronged. It was a ritual so profound, so sacred, it was utterly beyond his comprehension, that his soul understood it perfectly. He was being remade. The sun was high in the sky when they left. The great fire was banked, the warriors melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. Para Okum was the last to leave. He stood before Pitantua, the man who was once Jedediah. "The girl's name is Tsapita," the chief said. "Beautiful ember. She will stay with her mother's sister in the northern camps. But this place," he gestured to the small valley, the ridge, the cabin, "this is your watch. You will be the guardian of this pass. You will be a bridge that no bluecoat can cross. You belong to the Mank now. Not by blood, but by debt. With a final lingering look, the chief turned and walked away, disappearing into the vast, shimmering expanse of the plains. Jedediah, now Peta and Co, did not vanish back into the white world. He did not die defending the tribe from a belated threat. He stayed. The cabin remained his home, but it was no longer a tomb. It was an outpost, a sacred charge. The canyon in his heart did not vanish, but it was no longer empty. It was now a place where a single precious ember glowed. He lived out his days. On that ridge, a solitary, watchful figure. He became a legend to the few settlers who trickled into the territory, the wild man of the hills, the hermit who spoke to no one. They saw a gaunt man with a sun-bleached beard and strange, faded marks on his face. They did not see the guardian. The Comanche saw him. They would pass through the valley on their seasonal migrations, and sometimes a warrior would leave a haunch of venison or a bundle of herbs on his doorstep. They never spoke to him. They did not need to. He was part of the land now, part of their story. Years passed. His hair turned white, his body grew frail, but his eyes remained as sharp as a hawk's. He tended his small garden, kept his watch, and felt the seasons turn. The ghosts of the canyon were still there, but they no longer screamed. They whispered, and sometimes, in the quiet hum of the wind, he thought he could hear the faint echo of a girl's song. He was no longer a man of one world, but a sentinel standing between two, his life a long, silent prayer of atonement. He died alone, in his chair, looking out at the ridge as the sun set. A hunting party found him days later, his face peaceful, the old marks of ash and clay seeming to stand out on his weathered skin. They did not bury him in the white man's way. They wrapped him in a buffalo robe and placed his body on a high scaffold on the ridge he had guarded for so long, letting his spirit return to the vast open sky he had come to know as his only temple. On the canyon wall, miles away, where the memories of the people were carved in stone, a new pictograph appeared. It showed a man with a beard, standing before a fire, his face marked by 3 lines. Beside him, a single glowing ember. And beneath it, a truth was whispered from one generation to the next, a final epitaph for the man who had been remade by the very people he had nearly destroyed. He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.